Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. I'm recording this immediately after Finland and Sweden formally applied to join NATO. This is a truly momentous event and something for which the implications will be felt for decades to come. And I'll go into my in-depth analysis as to why that is. A couple of housekeeping things. First, I apologize for the camera not being set up. I am still on the road. As most of you will be aware, Charlene and I just spent a full month going through the Baltic. It was a magnificent trip, many memories to be treasured forever. I came back for just a couple of days to Australia before flying off to Manila in the Philippines, where they had their election. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is now president-elect of the Philippines. The Philippines is a very important country. It's an important archipelago, and I'll do a special podcast on this country. It might be of interest to you, but because it's not Baltic content specifically, I will restrict it to Contribui members. If you wish to support our channel financially, you can do that on Contribui. It's a Patreon alternative, a Lithuanian startup. We've met the founders. We're really excited about their work. I'll leave a link in the description, and that podcast should be up in the next couple of days for the Contribui members. Also, I am now in the national capital of Australia. I came back to do some work there. And it's where my interest in the Baltic all began. It all happened due to this statue. It's a statue of Egle, and it's in our Glee Park. And it was just there randomly. And my discovery, my research on why that statue was there, and then, of course, the story of Egle itself, led to my lifelong interest in that entire region. So it all began where I am sitting right now. Now, as for Sweden and Finland, of course, this is all obviously in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and it wasn't something that was ever really contemplated by these countries before that. And the first question is why? Why did Sweden and Finland not join NATO until now? Well, during the Cold War, it was just totally unfeasible. The Soviet Union was vastly more powerful than Russia is today. It occupied all of Eastern Europe. Even at its weakest, it had 300 divisions as a standing army, and any move by Sweden or Finland to negate their neutrality would have led immediately to invasion and war, a war that neither country could hope to win, nor would the United States be interested in fighting it. So there was no prospect of Sweden and Finland joining NATO, even if they wanted to, because neutrality was considered essential for their national survival. But then, after the Cold War ended, the border between NATO and what had hitherto been the Warsaw Pact shifted dramatically. And as we know, NATO went through a series of enlargements, culminating in the Baltic countries joining NATO during the Iraq War, where France and Germany were implacably opposed. And the Baltic countries saw an opportunity where they could support the United States, which was in desperate need of political allies. They were feeling really isolated in the conflict in the Middle East. And while the Iraq War was an unmitigated disaster for the United States, it proved to be a great opportunity for the Baltic countries. If any region of the world actually won that war, it was Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia who gained NATO membership through their support. Now, this had significant strategic implications for Finland and certainly Sweden, because during the Cold War, the frontier between East and West was East and West Germany. Now the Baltic countries needed to be defended. You had the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad to the west, Russia proper in the east, a very flat territory where these Baltic countries exist, previously occupied, of course, during the Cold War. And the idea that the Americans and others could even hope to defend the Baltic countries was an open question in NATO force planning. And prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's defense planning for the Baltic countries rested on a so-called rapid response force. That is, that hopefully NATO could hold back a full-scale Russian invasion long enough for the Western NATO allies to mobilize and therefore storm the beaches of Baltic countries and invade Kaliningrad without having to retake territory that had already been taken and fortified by Russian forces. Now, in order to achieve this, it was known that there had to be 24-hour air sorties against Russian positions to slow their advance, positions that could only be targeted from Swedish airfields. And to a significant degree, this motivated Russia to field new ballistic missile variants, missiles that violated the INF Treaty. You'll recall the United States publicly accused Russia of violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty from 2013 onwards. Now, at that time, America played down the implications of that violation, saying that, well, as China and India and Pakistan were fielding new ballistic missiles that weren't covered by the treaty, it made sense for Russia to feel as though it had to respond. Now, the treaty prohibited any missiles being fielded between 500 to 5,500 kilometers in range. The idea being that they didn't want to turn Europe proper into a nuclear battlefield. It was one of the late treaties of the Cold War to really de-escalate tensions during perestroika. The violation of this treaty actually had a different motivation, which was the realization that Sweden would be dragged into a war over the Baltic countries, irrespective of whether Sweden was a neutral party or a member of NATO. And therefore, Russia was going to disable or attempt to disable Swedish airfields to deny them to NATO forces in the event of a full-scale invasion of the Baltic countries. This was the generally accepted rationale at the time. But this fact wasn't lost on Sweden, and it began to increasingly cooperate with NATO forces, knowing that the frontier of any conflict between East and West would no longer be in faraway Germany, but right on its doorstep in the Baltic Sea, and therefore it had to participate, integrate more into NATO force planning, even if it itself was not a member, and there was no appetite to join. Now, if we think about the attitude of the Western European countries prior to the war in Ukraine, they had ceased to consider Russia a military threat at all. The question arose at the end of the Cold War, should NATO be disbanded? Why does NATO even exist if the Cold War is over, if the Russian threat is gone? And the reason it had continued is it sort of morphed into a military coalition, what the French sort of call a security promoter. So they would be coalitions of the willing, if you like, where they would bomb Kosovo, they would do interventions in Libya, Syria, other places, and would give them an excuse to cooperate militarily, a legal basis, if you like, to continue joint operations, even though the raison d'etre of NATO to protect Western Europe from a Soviet invasion had, from their perspective, disappeared. And this gave NATO a strange status in international military partnerships. There are many multilateral military affiliations around the world. Few of them are as harsh and direct as NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all, a clear, firm fist to anyone that aggresses against NATO allies. Most basically provide very little obligation on the parties, but enables various joint operations, joint training exercises, the transfer and sale of various military equipment, essentially providing some sort of legal basis for working together in loose coalitions. And NATO, without changing the charter, had become, for countries like France and Germany, and to a lesser extent the UK, essentially a security promoter where they could go around and counter-terrorism exercises, nation building and so forth, without worrying so much as hard power aspect of member states being invaded by Russia. And to the extent that that might occur, there was great reluctance on many of the Western NATO countries to shore up the security of the eastern frontier. Many in both Western Europe, but also Washington in recent years, thought that NATO had extended too far, particularly with the rise of China. First, the difficulty of defending the Eastern European countries, particularly the Baltic countries, as I mentioned, but also the desire to woo Russia out of China's orbit, to appeal to Russia's European sensibilities, to be part of a containment strategy to prevent China making a bid for hegemony, and trying to persuade Russia that it has a future in Europe separate to being an extremely junior partner with China in trying to reset the global order and diminish American primacy in world affairs. Now, in that context, it was totally unthinkable for Sweden and particularly Finland to join NATO as a formal partner. Whatever the open door policy says, had Finland applied to join NATO prior to the war in Ukraine, it would have been roundly rejected by many, many NATO countries, and of course would be rejected by the Finnish themselves, where NATO accession never enjoyed more than 20% support. And this is because it would invite a Russian invasion immediately. I mean, if Finland had, prior to the war in Ukraine, said we want to join NATO, the next day, or even the same day, Russian forces would have been pouring across Finland to start another Russia-Finnish war. And if you want to know how Russia's war in Ukraine is really going, it's worth noting Vladimir Putin's response to Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Prior to the war, it would have been, this is an outrage, we're going to invade you. Well, Putin did not say that at all. He said that Finland and Sweden joining NATO is not a threat to Russia. I mean, take note of that. That Finland, with a 1,300-kilometer border with the Russian Federation, joining a military alliance that was designed and crafted and exists to withstand against any kind of Russian encroachment, that the whole war in Ukraine itself was ostensibly, from Putin's point of view, to prevent any further expansion of NATO. That was one of the great conditions of preventing the war in the first place during the pre-war negotiations, was that the United States would commit to never allowing any new countries to join NATO. So this was considered a core security interest of the Russian Federation, and an alienable core security interest that it was worth Russia going to war, including nuclear war, to prevent from happening. And yet when Sweden and Finland do apply to join NATO, Putin's response is this isn't a major threat. He did caution against putting major military deployments into Finland, but otherwise said that this is something that Russia can live with and shouldn't worry about too much. Now, that is the voice of a defeated man. He knows that he has lost in Ukraine. The end of Russia's occupation of Ukraine is ultimately inevitable. Yes, the destruction continues to be wrought. Mariupol has been totally destroyed, but Russia's fighting strength has been utterly crippled over the past months. The billions, tens of billions of dollars in military support that's pouring into Ukraine each and every week, the training, the advanced military technology, that is resulting in the total devastation of Russia's armed forces. The increasing morale boost that Ukraine seems to be enjoying every single day, the high quality training that ordinary conscripts in Ukraine are receiving before they go into combat using advanced military equipment and gear and tactics. Russia's military forces cannot sustain these operations and may well be defeated outright. It won't be a matter of just Russia running out of money and ammunition, but could just be straight up defeated on the battlefield in the coming summer month season. I would not be surprised by that at all. And the pain for Russia runs deeper than just the failure of Putin's imperialist ambition. Of course, there will not be a greater Russia. There won't be Ukraine, Baltic countries, and Poland part of a restored Russian empire. But the whole reason for having an imperial Russia from the perspective of Moscow was that they were the so-called leaders of the Slavic people, particularly the Orthodox Slavs, the Eastern Slavs, those that use Cyrillic. Well, that delusion has been totally shattered by this war. All of that moral authority has ebbed away and has flowed directly into Kiev, which is, after all, the city where Orthodox Christianity began for the Rus. And in the future, Russia will be the sort of weakened satellite that will be turning increasingly to Beijing for its continued economic survival, let alone expansionist hopes and desires. That said, the expansion of NATO to include Finland does have long-term strategic implications. And I would say, given Russia's failure in Ukraine, utter defeat in Ukraine, that is going to turn out to be reasonably positive, but with some long-term risks. So what do I mean by that? Well, on the positive side, it certainly improves the security of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Russia cannot, even if it rebuilds its armed forces, learns its lessons from Ukraine, cannot invade the Baltic countries without fear of retaliation from NATO, given that Finland is part of NATO, and there'll be a whole extra front that Russia has to consider. The whole security of St. Petersburg gets called into question, and the security of any advanced forces that go into the Baltic countries have many more vectors of threat. The beefing up of the military presence in the Eastern European countries, I don't think is going to be reduced in any foreseeable future. So the direct defense of the Baltic states is very great, but also the expansion of NATO to include Finland and Sweden to stretch out Russia's military strategic vulnerability. Well, that is going to lead to increased security for the Baltic countries because it dramatically reduces Russia's willingness or capacity to launch a successful invasion of those countries, which prior to the war in Ukraine was almost assumed to be an inevitability once China invades Taiwan. So when China seeks to take on the United States and America is all tied up, it was assumed that Russia would move into the Baltic countries to challenge NATO while America's back was to the wall. But even if that was to happen now, even if there was to be a hegemonic struggle between China and the United States, well, the European countries themselves can easily take on Russia. And particularly with the diminishing of Russia's armed forces, even if they would have rebuilt those forces, the military focus on the Eastern European countries, the eastern periphery of NATO, is such that Russia would not just be facing a divided Europe, but a Europe that was all on board with defending these eastern countries. And to that end, the view of Germany and France and others that had seen NATO as a security promoter, that were deeply reluctant to build up any military presence in the Baltic countries, that generally thought that NATO had expanded too far and didn't worry about Russia invading the Baltic countries. Well, that has all completely disappeared. The NATO alliance has been reinvigorated on the basis of its original purpose, which is to guard against Russian aggression. This time, I don't think the United States will be there fully committed in the way that it had been in the past, but it'll have countries like the United Kingdom. They will take up the mantle of defending the Baltic region, the deepening security cooperation with the Nordic countries, all working together. Poland's military revival, the increase of defense spending in Sweden as well. All of that will mean that Russia shall be militarily contained for the foreseeable future. The drawback, and there is a drawback, is that when the conflict in the Pacific invariably arises, and I do think that this will happen, Russia will have rebuilt its armed forces. It will have learned some of the military lessons of the conflict with Ukraine, and the 1,300-kilometer barrier with NATO will become a very tempting target for Russia. So while the security of the Baltic countries will be variably strengthened, the security of Finland is going to be an open question because there will be continued reluctance to build up a significant military presence in Finland during peacetime. That's because Russia, I think, is fairly serious about threatening any permanent offensive military capabilities with tactical nuclear weapons. It's already deployed nuclear-capable Iskander missiles to the Finnish border, and it will tolerate Finland's membership of NATO while it doesn't have significant military deployments in Finland. Any sort of massive military build-up in these countries, I think, will occur in Sweden. That's just my prediction. But in the event of Russia having rebuilt its armed forces, it will seek to invade Finland, I think, at the first available opportunity, but we'll wait for America to be completely distracted because Russia's defeat in Ukraine is largely because America has had a free hand in assisting the Ukrainians both with arms and equipment and money, but in the event that the United States is focused on a contingency in the Pacific, that will no longer be the case, and Finland is a long way from France and Germany and the United Kingdom, and so their security will be an open question, and particularly since I don't see a massive military build-up in Finland to be likely. That includes, the Western NATO partners. There won't be some super base like there is in Okinawa and other places put in Finland. Finland will be somewhat vulnerable if and when that does occur. That said, overall, this will cripple Russia's imperialist ambitions and shows the extent of Russia's failure, that the very core strategic interest that Putin was claiming to avoid has been invited by Putin's Ukraine adventure, that in addition to all the other weakenings of Russia's military strength, the crippling of Russia's economy, its political isolation, the reinvigoration of NATO partners, it could not have come at a more devastating time for Russia, but a strong time for the West. And I think it's also given the West a much needed confidence boost. There was a great sort of sense of malaise culturally in terms of various political ideologies being at conflict with the West, criticizing the West. We had sort of refugee crises and others. And now, there is a sense that, no, the West can stand up together and actually achieve things together and face down tyranny. And Finland and Sweden have joined that group. And Putin's fairly meek reaction to it is an admission of failure. That's the only way to look at it, because if this had happened prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, then it would have been an immediate and overwhelming response from the Kremlin, including military force. So when Russia is ultimately pushed out of much of Ukraine, that'll be a great tactical victory for the Ukrainians. It'll be a real coming of age for the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian people, and that's how history will remember it. But the biggest strategic implication, I think, is the expansion of NATO to include these very important Nordic countries, Sweden and Finland, and the long-term strategic implication of having some 1,300 extra kilometers added to the NATO border with Russia, and what that will mean for European-Russia relations. It can go one of two ways. The first way is, as I mentioned, that Russia bides its time, rebuilds its armed forces. After all, this war will not devastate its industrial base internally in Russia. It will rebuild its armies. It will learn some harsh lessons. And then when the time comes that is most favorable, it could attack NATO directly. That is a real risk. But the other thing that could happen is NATO becomes so powerful in the East that Russia knows that it has no hope of overcoming NATO in the future and ceases to try. And when it gives up the fight, it will have the alternative of improving relations with Europe. And I think of Israel's Arab neighbors in that respect. In several occasions, Arab countries sought to wipe Israel off the map. They were comprehensively defeated each time, to the point where Israel became so predominant in the Middle East that all the Arab countries realized that they had no hope of overcoming Israel's conventional forces, and Israel was also a nuclear power. So that ultimately led to peace deals being made, with Jordan, with Egypt, even now warming relations with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. So this is likely to happen in the future. If Russia realizes that it has no realistic prospect of fighting NATO, then it will give up its imperialist ambition. I think in the meantime, there'll be a significant cultural shift where the epicenter of Slavic identity and culture moves to Kiev, moves to the Ukrainians and to Poland, those countries that were sort of formerly part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That will become, in my view, the epicenter of Slavic culture, whether it's the Catholics in Poland or the Orthodox in Kiev. The whole Slavic mythos will be centered around that region, and Moscow will be seen as sort of a backwater. Anyway, that's my view. Great moment for NATO, for Europe, and for the Finns and the Swedes, as well as all the countries in the region. Thank you so much for listening to this. If you found value in this discussion, do hit the like button. It helps grow the channel a ton. Share these videos with others. It lets the algorithm know that there's strong engagement. If you have any thoughts, leave them down below, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.